welcome in to another episode of the Barnes on Bama podcast. I'm your host, Owen Barnes, and we have a ton to discuss. Basketball season is upon us, and if you cannot tell, I am super excited. Obviously, we have our football off week, and just to come in to save the day, we've got basketball season right around the corner. We're going to talk about that North Dakota game that's going to be happening on Monday. I'm going to break it down in this episode. I have a couple of things I want to talk about here up at the top. Got a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll get right into the game. First things first, for anybody that's interested in the pregame threads, those are still going to be hosted on my Twitter as they have been the last couple of seasons. But additionally, if you'll see scrolling down below me, all of my written content is also, I have a couple of articles that have come out being hosted on barnesonbama.com. There you can find full length episodes. If you are new to the show, you'll find all my catalog of episodes, as well as all the written content I've already put out. There may be some additional stuff that I put out on there, but if you're ever curious what I have going on, that's a good place to start. Again, additionally, we will be talking about that North Dakota game. That's going to be posted on my Twitter, and it's going live on Monday. I have already written it. I'm going to use some of the information from that in the discussions that we have today about the team. Additionally, if you have not already seen my episode, I recorded a really, really fun episode breaking down the entire non-conference preview with Jordan Harper, previously of Tide Illustrated. He currently hosts the Double Dribble podcast on Alabama basketball. It's on my channel, so if you have not had a chance to check that one out, I really would recommend you do so. We talked about all the different non-conference games and some of the things that I think we're expecting to see. So I think that was a really, really fun episode. I really enjoy getting record with Jordan. But like I said, if you haven't got a chance to see it, I definitely would recommend you check it out. As always, and you will see down here below, I am sponsored by the Believe Podcast Network. Because of that, if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, you may hear ads, and anything you could do to help out those sponsors, we would appreciate. That keeps it free to everybody here. As always, the way to support me is if you could just subscribe to the channel. And that's the last thing I wanted to talk about before we got right into the content. Some of y'all may have seen that I posted on Twitter and Facebook that I, did some research into my channel earlier this week, and I realized that I have had over 150,000 views this year, which is absolutely incredible. I'm super thankful for all the people that watch these episodes. I really do appreciate it. But over 88% of the people that have watched these videos are not currently subscribed. So if you could do me a favor, if you're not currently subscribed, if you could do me a favor and subscribe. We have a lot of basketball content here upcoming. We're doing 2 videos a week, every week through the end of the year. So it's going to be a lot of fun coming out, and I think you're really going to be interested. Obviously, we're not going to stop with the football content. So this is kind of my busiest time of year with football and basketball for the month of November, but it's going to be super exciting, and, subscribe and join the ride because it's going to be a very fun time. But with all that said, let's get right into the basketball news. First things first, I actually want to start with one thing that is not the North Dakota preview, and it's that Labaron, Philon and Aden Holloway were both named to the preseason SEC coaches, rankings. They're named preseason All SEC, and Labaron Philon is a first-team preseason All SEC guy. Aden Holloway is a third-team preseason guy. I think that Labaron Philon being on that list doesn't shock anyone. Obviously, with him returning, he's going to be one of the top names in this entire conference. Him getting named to that watch list, being on that preseason team, I think is fully expected. He's going to be a guy that's going to be competing for a lot of national lists. Him being on the SEC list, I think is completely understandable. I think the name that may have shocked a few people was Aden Holloway, but I will say year 2 in this system, I think that Aden Holloway is going to have a lot of success. You've already seen some of that success in like the exhibition games. You've also seen Aden Holloway stepping up his defense, which is something that Nate Oats talked about in his press conference, was that Aden had done a really good job, stepping up the defense, talking more, feeling more comfortable in the system and everything that comes with being a second-year guy in a college system. I think that it's really, really good to have a guy like Aden that's been able to turn a little bit of that corner and get more accustomed to what Alabama plays like. Again, when you play in a different system, whether it be Auburn or anyone else that runs more set plays, you have to learn how Nate Oats wants you to play both in the offense and in the defense. I think that Aden is learning more and more about that. By the end of the year, you could tell he was substantially more comfortable than he was at the beginning. And I think that that's going to continue on throughout the course of this next season. Additionally, I saw that he gained a little bit of weight and some muscle in the offseason. If he adds that with some of his defensive pressure on the perimeter, I think that he could be a plus defender, right? At the end of the day, you're not expecting Aden Holloway to be a true defensive stopper, but if he can give you something on the defensive end that's more than you're typically getting out of somebody that's as an elite offensive weapon as he is, but additionally, he's somebody that Nate will want to keep on the floor for longer stretches because he's a guy that can turn that defense into offense and is somebody that really makes the team better in every facet of the game, right? That's what Nate Oats is looking for when he's going for these guys, and I think that Aden Holloway definitely has a ability to get you to that point. The other thing that I wanted to talk about that was mentioned this week is Nate Oats had his press conference just the other day, and I think that there were a couple of important notes that I think are worth talking about in that game, or sorry, in that press conference. The first one we'll cover now. We'll talk a little bit about it in the preview as well. But is Latrell Wrightsell? He mentioned that Latrell Wrightsell had a 16-minute limit in the exhibition, and that Trelly went right up to that limit, and it was perfect. That was the amount of time that they had available for him to be able to play. But, even because of how much Alabama was up, it didn't feel like they needed to play him anymore. He kind of alluded to the fact that he expects Clark to give him another number heading into the North Dakota game. Nate said it without saying it, but he's of the mindset that number's, going to increase. So my gut would say maybe 20, 24 minutes. And when it increases, he suspects Trelly will not be needed the amount of time that he's going to be given. And so it may not feel like Trelly is on a true minutes restriction. Again, similar to that Furman game, they said he was on a minutes restriction. And then even in the 16 minutes, that's about how much everybody else got. So it didn't really feel like Trelly was too much limited compared to anyone else. I think that in this North Dakota game, and we'll talk about why I think that, but I do think that Trelly is going to be able to play the amount of time that he's needed in that game. And 20 to 24 minutes, I do not think that we will need him past that. And I think that it will be good to get him back into the flow of the game and kind of continue on. Some additional things that Nate talked about. He talked about, playing the idea, and something that me and Jordan talked about was playing with different lineups, going all small with Taylor Bowen or Keaton Bristow at the 5 versus having the stretch 5s out there. It seemed like Nate wasn't opposed to the option. Obviously, we know he likes to play with lineups, but it also sounds like his analytics company sounded like they were a better team when you had a true 5 on the floor, or I guess a Nate Oats true 5 on the floor, as in like Noah Williamson or Aiden Sherrill. So it does seem like for a decent stretch of the games, he's going to want to have that. But it did seem like the potential limiter with that is he said that it seems like Noah and Aden potentially are going to be doing shorter stints on the floor and be swapping in and out a little bit more frequently so that they can run and keep up with our pace. Because he said the thing is, when you're out there, he wants you to be hustling and not the reason we have to slow down the offense. But if that means that you have to swap in and out more often, then that's okay. That's just one of the points that he made in that press conference. And I thought that it was worth mentioning because, like I said, me and Jordan did talk a little bit about what we thought about the front court and some of the front court issues related to defense. And Nate Oats kind of, addressed some of those. I know he talked about setting screens similar to Noah Williamson. There were some things that he talked about. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, I definitely would recommend you do so. But I think that there were a few things that were fairly relevant that were talked about in that one. He was additionally talking about leadership, and he thought that the leadership on this team is really good. You have guys like Houston Millett, who he raves over and over and over again, watches some of the most film in the entire team. A guy like Latrell Wrightsell that's not afraid to speak his mind. And that it really helps when you have guys like that are giving 100% effort all the time, because when they're giving the effort and they're a quality player, it means that their teammates are more willing to listen to them because obviously they're giving that effort. They're a quality player. It's not some random person just telling you to play better when they're not playing very good themselves. So he did say it seemed like the leadership was really good on this team. He wants to keep hearing guys speak up more and more, but overall, he's very happy with what he's heard and doesn't think that, leadership will be an issue on this team. Some pretty basic beginning of the year stuff. If you've watched a lot of NATO's press conferences, I didn't think that there was anything super crazy that was mentioned, but did think that there were a couple of things that were worth talking about. So those are the ones. I guess the last one that we'll mention, just remembered, was Labaron Philon talking about turnovers. He talked about how Labaron had multiple turnovers in the games, and that was something that he was definitely concerned about. But had stressed to Labaron that, hey, if you're going to be the point guard in this system and be the lead ball guy in this system, you're going to need to not turn over the basketball. Having 5 turnovers as the main point guard is not an option. We can't have you out there turning over the ball with how fast we play and such. Like, we can't have that happen. He talked about how they went live for 16 minutes, at least the day of the press conference. He had not had any turnovers. He thinks that Labaron is understanding kind of what that role is going to look like. You know, he's somebody that isn't an experienced guy, obviously, having played last year in the system. And doesn't think that it's going to be a problem, but it is something to kind of watch out for here at the beginning of the year. I know we've talked about how turnovers sometimes for NATO's teams is something that you struggle with a little bit in non-conference play. We'll be curious to see what the identity of this team is, because there's a few things with turnovers, with offensive rebounding, with pace, with some of these things that I feel like NATO's teams, they all have a similar identity, but some of them are better than others at certain things. So, like, for example, last year's team, the pace was almost always perfect, right? Like, you basically never had a team that was able to slow down Alabama's pace. I suspect that to be the case this season, just with who we have on the floor. I think that Alabama is going to be able to keep that pace up this season. Additionally, you look at a team like, is this going to be a major turnover team? We're going to have to see. Is this going to be a good offensive rebounding team? We're going to have to see, right? Those are some of the things that I think you just have to kind of think about when you're talking about NATO's early season teams and kind of what you're taking out of each game, because sometimes those can be, taken one way or another. And finally, we will talk about this North Dakota game. So, as I mentioned, Alabama takes on North Dakota, and this is on Monday evening on November the 3rd at 7 p.m. This game is going to be on SEC Network Plus, ESPN Plus, for anybody that is not at the game. If you missed my episode with Jordan, I announced that unfortunately I'm not going to be at this game. A friend of mine from my small group is actually going to be using my ticket, so no need to fear. My ticket is going to be used. I was more than happy to have somebody that's going to be able to sit in the seat and cheer on Alabama to go to the game. But my fiance actually has an interview out of town on Monday, and so we're going to be traveling back from that interview on Monday during game time. So I will not be in attendance for this game. I will be in attendance for the next home game against Purdue. No need to fear. But like I said, for this first one, unfortunately, I'm not going to be there. But with all that being said, I think this is going to be a good chance for Alabama to be on the floor, right? It's going to be a good chance for Alabama to have another game again, but in this time, one that can count in the win column. Obviously the exhibitions are always good because you're able to play somebody that's not yourself. That's something that Nate and all the players talk about, is just happy to get on the floor and be able to go up against somebody that doesn't have the same jersey as you do. But I think that the difference is when you're talking about this, obviously this game now counts in the win-loss column. And when you're looking at North Dakota, at least for the players that were on the team last season, I think it's a little more than that. I think that the team kind of got embarrassed last season. Last season, if you don't remember, Alabama played North Dakota at North Dakota in Grand Forks. That was full disclosure, NATO has been very open about why they scheduled that game. That was a game for Grant Nelson to be able to go back home. And it was a game that, hey, we're going to have it where he can have his whole family there. He can have all of his friends there, and this is a homecoming of sorts for Grant Nelson. We've done some of these games. We scheduled a game in Canada that was supposed to be for Charles Bediako. Unfortunately, Bediako went to the NBA, so we still end up playing in Canada. We did one in Omaha, which was for Trelly, right? Nate tries to schedule, if possible, some of these games on the road near some of his players' hometowns, especially if they've been in the system for a little bit of time. And that game was for Grant Nelson. And the way that they made it work is it was a 2-for-1. So 1 at North Dakota and 2 in Coleman Coliseum. So this is the first of those return trips for that game. And, quite frankly, North Dakota embarrassed Alabama in that game. Alabama won the game, but that wasn't the story that came out of that game. The story that came out of that game was the fact that Trace and Eaglestaff scored 40 points. North Dakota took us to the wire and ends up losing just 97 to 90, right? They lost by 7 points. And, Trace and Eaglestaff ends up getting a pretty large NIL offer from South Carolina, accepts it, then ends up going to West Virginia. But either way, right, like, this is a game that the story of the game was not Alabama and Grant Nelson's homecoming. The story of the game became the 40-point score and the 7-point, differential in this game, when in a game that Alabama honestly should have been much better, right? We should have been the easily better team, and that was not the story of the game. The story of the game was Eaglestaff. Now we come back to Coleman's Coliseum, and Alabama will be looking to get revenge on that. In my mind, this will be a situation where, first off, we just mentioned Eagle staff is no longer on the team. I think that's worth mentioning for anybody that watched the prior game because this team that you're going to be playing, in my research, only 3 of the guys on this current roster played in that game. There were a couple of others on the roster, some redshirted. George from Georgia did not play. Um, they have some other guys on the team that did not play in that game that were just either freshmen, played toward the end of the year, etc. But only 3 of the guys currently on this roster played in that first game. So it's a much different lineup shakeup than what you saw last season. They have just one starter back from last season. It's 6'4" Eli King. He shot about 38% from deep last season. He had, over 100 attempts on the year. So, averaging over 3 attempts a game. He is somebody that's pretty good. He had 8 points last season, including 2 of 3 from behind the arc. He is somebody that I think, Alabama will have to just keep an eye on because I think he's probably their best shooter. Additionally, he did have 5 steals in their exhibition against Minnesota, and was a top 100 steal rate guy as a sophomore at North Dakota. So this is a guy that, you're just going to need to be strong with the ball around him. I believe he previously played at Iowa State. So again, he's a guy that has some high major experience as well as, has played well in some other games. Again, he had 8 points. Nothing crazy to write home about, but definitely was a plus player in that first game. Their kind of leading scorer and the new guy that's kind of taking over for North Dakota that you kind of need to know about is Garrett Anderson. He's transferred from Central Washington. He had 14 and 12 in the 2 scrimmages. He averaged 14 points a game at the Division II level. He is completely new to the roster. Obviously, playing at Division II last season, but he looks to be a guy that's going to step in, and they're going to be asking a lot of him. He took a lot of shots in their scrimmages, and is somebody that I'm sure, in a different way, but is potentially going to dominate the ball at certain times of the game. Would not shock me at all. The other 2 guys that played in their prior game, or sorry, I think they redshirted last season. Um, both freshmen, one redshirted last season, and one is going into his true freshman year. Is Grayson Ullman and Marley Curtis. Curtis had 10 3-point attempts over the exhibition, so he's not afraid to step back and shoot them. He's 6'8", so they do have a little bit of a stretch guy that can stretch you out a little bit. Ullman's a red shirt. Again, the part of the problem with this roster when I was doing some of the research is this roster is very unknown, right? Even the people that had playing time, Eli King is by far the only guy that's super well known that played a lot of time on the team. The other people that have played substantial minutes, like Garrett Anderson, played at the Division II level, so it's just hard to know if it's going to fully um, track up to the Division I level. Then you have some of the guys that played last season in very sparing matchups, like Zach Kraft did play in the game last season. He had 9 points. He went 3 of 7 from deep. He pretty much was just a 3-point marksman. Didn't have any other assists or anything else in that game. Really just took the 3-point attempts. George I'm not going to pretend to announce his last name because I don't want to butcher it. He's 6'10". He's their big guy, right? I guess he's one of 2 big guys. They do have a little bit of size at 6'10" and 6'9". That's not the craziest thing from a smaller team, but full disclosure, Georgia was on the team last season, played in like 20 something games, but Alabama was not one of them. I will be curious to see if that's a situation of they didn't think that he could keep up with the pace of the game, so he's not going to play much in this one, or if it's going to be a situation where he just was not as ready because he came from European basketball, was getting more accustomed to what it was like here over in the States in college, and that he is going to play some in this game, right? Last season, they did not play anybody over that 6'8", 6'9". That's pretty standard when Alabama plays mid-majors. A lot of these schools do not have huge big men. That's one of the front court is honestly one of the weaknesses when you're talking about some of these smaller schools. That's one of the things that they really struggle to be able to get is guys in that 6'10", 6'11" range that are really skilled, because typically those guys that are super skilled at that size start going, a little bit better conferences, so to speak. So we'll be very curious to see what they trot out from that standpoint. I've seen Nate Oats attack this in two different ways. I've seen these smaller teams where Nate Oats, just goes inside and just destroys the interior, and like we're just going to feed Aden Sherrill and Noah Williamson time after time after time again. I think that that's a real possibility. I could also see a situation where, even though we just talked about Nate Oats, thinking that having a center on the floor is okay, I think that there is a world in which Keaton Bristow or Taylor Boboin is your five for this game. And honestly, it looks more like the Florida State game from a pace perspective. And you just get out and run. And because North Dakota shoots a lot of threes anyways, this is a team that, North Dakota shoots a lot of threes. Of course, Alabama shoots a lot of threes. The pace on this game I expect to be pretty fast, high 70s to 80 possessions. I don't think is outside of the realm of possibility. I think this is a game that Alabama will get the pace up and pretty easily because of the threes that are taken. So I think that that is one thing that you kind of need to, just be aware of that. And something that me and Jordan talked about in the prior episode, do not suspect, and we'll talk about why in just one second, but do not suspect that Nate Oats is going to play the exact lineup that he's going to play in the St. John's game or in the Purdue game in this game. And I think that's for 2 to 3 reasons. One, the size of the front court that we just talked about, right? The fact that they are only starting one guy at about 6'8". George is 6'10", yes, but obviously didn't play in last season's matchup. Their center is 6'9". They just don't have quite the size that you're going to face against the St. John's or Purdue. Additionally, quite frankly, this team is not obviously as good as St. John's and Purdue. So I think that that also sometimes impacts the lineup rotations, because sometimes when you feel like you have a little bit more of a lead and a little bit more cushion, you feel a little bit more free to do some things with the lineup that you wouldn't always do. And the same reason why the scrimmage, you felt super open to do anything you wanted to do because the game didn't count. I think that once you get a little bit of a lead, that's something that Nate Oats is kind of accustomed to doing, is changing a little bit more of the lineups. Additionally, we talked about, earlier in this episode, we talked about how Latrell Reitzel is going to be on a minutes restriction in this game, but Nate kind of alluded to in his press conference that Charlie's probably going to be, more minutes than in the scrimmage. And so since it was 16 in the scrimmage, I'm extrapolating, 20 to 24 is kind of my expectation for Trelly. And Nate alluded to the fact that there's a possibility that Trelly wasn't going to play any more than that. You know, I feel like what personally, I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but what I thought Nate was trying to say was, I think that we're going to be able to be up by enough without Trelly having to play more than 20 to 24 minutes. We're good enough that we should be able to do that against this team. Again, don't want to put words in his mouth. He's not talking down to a team, but I do think that that is a real possibility that Alabama plays Latrell Reitzel 20 minutes and we're up by 30 points, and it doesn't really matter if he stays out there or not. We just got him some run and, got him more comfortable with some additional minutes, and he's going to be ready to go for St. John's or Purdue, right? I think that's a real possibility. So I think that you have to consider some of that when you're looking at the lineups, because when you have Latrell Reitzel working back from the minutes restriction, when you additionally have the lack of size of the front court that a team like North Dakota has, I would suspect that Nate Oats isn't going to play the exact lineups he's going to play for St. John's and for Purdue. So if you're going into this first game hoping that you know the exact minutes rotation, the exact lineups, scratch that. After St. John's and Purdue, I think you'll have a little bit more of an idea, but I do think that for this one, I would not suspect that you're going to know too much. Like I said, that's my personal opinion. A little bit of a sneak preview as to who my player to watch is. My player to watch is actually Trelly. I think that Trelly is somebody that played really well last season in this game. He additionally, even though Nate had him on the minutes restriction, he did not allow that to cause him to be an issue in that Furman game. I thought that he did really well in the time that he had. His dribble seemed tight. I thought that the 1 3 that he made was super long. I thought that it was solid. Obviously, he missed some others. Trelly's shooting is going to come back to him. I'm not concerned about that. And I think that the speed in which this game is going to be played, I talked about how that pace is going to get up. I think that that fits right into Trelly's game. Additionally, the fact that he just does really good communicating, talking on the floor, and does a really good job on ball pressure and on the perimeter from a defensive perspective, I do think that Trelly is going to be one of your better players in this game, because I think that he's going to fit going up against what North Dakota likes to do. Finally, I will go ahead and give my prediction. Full disclosure, I do think that Nate Oats can kind of pick his score in this game. The big thing that we haven't discussed, and it's just because it's hard to discuss because they haven't played, and we're going with preseason numbers. But if y'all are aware or not aware, I do look at a lot of the KenPom numbers when I do both my preseason or my pregame threads and these breakdowns. And something that just jumps off the screen at you when you're looking at the KenPom numbers from North Dakota, and again, they're preseason, so it's hard to take them with too much credit, is that North Dakota is a bottom 30 team in the country in defense. I believe they're 337 in defense from a preseason perspective, which is atrocious. I mean, it is one of the worst defenses Alabama will have played in Nate Oats' tenure. When you compare that with the fact that I think that this might be one of Nate Oats' best shooting teams in Coleman Coliseum, I think that this is honestly a situation where if Nate wants to beat him by 50, he can. I think this will be a situation, however, that I think Nate's going to play around with the lineups. So I don't think that this is going to be, 120 to 50 kind of thing. I do think that Nate's going to play around with the lineups enough to try to see what works, see what doesn't work. But I still do think that Alabama wins this game fairly handily. I have the score at 106-68. I do think that Alabama's kind of going to able to exercise some demons from last season, put up over 100. I think that, there will be some emphasis on defense and guarding some of the actions that we struggled with last season that Alabama had a lot of issues with. A lot of that was just good shot making by Eagle staff, but I do think that Nate felt embarrassed by what happened last season. So I would expect him to try to ramp up the defense as best as possible and hold them under 70. So, like I said, I have the score at 106-68. I do think that this is going to be a good chance to be able to see Alabama, but if you're suspecting this is going to be a close game, this ain't going to be it, right? Again, not trying to talk too poorly down to a competition, because at the end of the day, this is a Division I basketball team that we're playing, and I don't want to, consider them awful. But in terms of Nate Oats' scheduling, this is much lower than the type of mid majors he typically schedules. When you think about like last season and then UNC Asheville or some of the teams like that he schedules, he typically is scheduling teams that are going to be potential NCAA tournament teams. I'm not aware of a single person that considers this North Dakota current in its current state an NCAA tournament team. This is more of a situation where, again, this is the return trip from that Grant Nelson game. So unfortunately, I do think that this isn't going to be quite as competitive as some of the other, smaller non-conference games that Nate Oats has scheduled. But nevertheless, I do think that this will be a very good chance to see Alabama basketball in its first live action of the year. So if you are excited for Alabama basketball and you want to see more content, like I said, if you could subscribe to the channel, I really would appreciate it. I know we've had a lot of content coming out here recently, and I really do appreciate all the support. Again, 150,000 views this month has meant the world to me, and I really do. Or sorry, 150,000 views this year has meant the world to me, and I really do appreciate it. If you enjoy the content, subscribe to the channel. If you're looking for more, throw a comment and let me know what you're interested in. Other than that, I will catch you on the next episode. Peace.